Our sermon this Sunday was on a very familiar story in the Bible, Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel is about to be promoted to a very high position in the Persian Empire, and some of his enemies try to stop that from happening. They have a problem, though. He's really good at his job, and he's honest, so they can't find anything to get him in trouble for. So they come up with an idea. They know he prays every day, so they decide to trick the king into making it illegal to pray for the next 30 days. The king passes the law, and Daniel continues to pray every day anyway. So they bring Daniel in, they tell the king that Daniel is violating the law, and the king is forced to throw Daniel into a pit of lions overnight, even though he likes Daniel and doesn't want to. He doesn't have a choice. He passed a law that he couldn't undo. And we know how the story ends. God protects Daniel throughout the night, and he comes out the next morning unharmed. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, anyone who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor." One of the interesting things about what the Apostle Paul writes in this passage is he was living in a time where Christians were actively being persecuted by the government. Paul himself was killed by the Roman government for being a Christian. Wait a second, Paul. How can you say that governments are established by God even when they're going against God? And what are we supposed to do when the government passes an evil law that we're not supposed to obey? How can they be God's servants? One of the things you notice about the story of Daniel is Daniel doesn't try to defend his actions before he's thrown to the lions. As near as we can tell, he doesn't try to get out of the punishment. In one sense, he rebelled against the law, but in another sense, he also submitted to it by accepting the punishment. Daniel had just seen the Babylonian Empire wiped out and replaced by the Persian Empire. So he knows that God can take down a nation whenever he wants. In this new nation, Daniel had an important government position. But that position wasn't as important as obeying God and continuing to pray. As we follow God, we always find ourselves subject to some kind of governance, wherever we live. Or maybe we find ourselves in some position of governance, where we're in charge of something important, like Daniel was. Governance is the job of keeping society functioning well, so that we're able to live in peace. Some people do it better than others. That's different than politics. Governance is about leading a society and keeping it working. Politics is about allegiance. It's about building followers and support, having allies. As Christians, we may find ourselves under different types of governments throughout our lives, but our allegiance is always to God above. That doesn't mean we can't serve the leaders in our community. Daniel was serving his king very faithfully. But when it came time to choose between following God or following a law, he chose to follow God. He didn't try to build political alliances. He didn't try to get support from other people or get votes in an election to gain power. He simply continued to pray. I'm sure you've seen in the past year people obsessed with politics. I like this leader. I'm going to follow this leader. No, you're bad. We should be following this leader. Politics often forces people into pledging their allegiance to someone who really isn't that good, someone you normally wouldn't want to be in charge, but you're convinced you have to support them because of your political allegiance. When that happens, you need to be careful because you can find yourself very quickly turned away from God and relying on people who don't have very good motives. But notice something very interesting about Daniel. Even after being thrown into a pit with lions, he continued to serve the Persian king. The next morning, Daniel comes out and he doesn't say, "Oh, you're a bad king now. I'm not going to work for you anymore." Despite everything that happened, he continued to faithfully help the king govern the Persian Empire because he knew that was the reason God had him there. And ultimately, the Persian Empire is what allows the nation of Israel to be rebuilt after having been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. Now, we need to be careful. Be wise about how we serve in a country that passes laws against God. But if we can help keep the peace and keep society functioning without being forced to do or support evil, let's do it whenever we can. And of course, when we vote, we do our best to vote for whoever seems wise or moral to us. Sometimes that's no one, but we do our best. And sometimes it can get bad enough that the only good choice is to leave. Proverbs 28:12 says, "When the righteous triumph, there is great celebration. But when the wicked rise to power, people go into hiding." It can be hard to trust God when wicked people come to power. I'm sure a lot of us are worried about Armenia and Artsakh right now. What's going to happen now that Azerbaijan has been able to steal so much and destroy so many lives? Will we ever be safe again? What's going to happen to the Armenians that have had to flee their homes to escape? Has God forgotten about us? I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I do know this. Wicked people come to power sometimes. And even if they hold on to it their whole lives, one day they're going to die and stand before God for judgment. And on that day, it doesn't matter how much power they had here on earth. There's no army to hide behind, no political allegiance to help them. If we can stop evil, we should. But if we can't, we'll leave things in God's hands and instead do good wherever we can. Because ultimately, our allegiance is with Jesus, who died for us so we could have eternal life. That's my video for the week. I hope everyone is doing well, and as always, if you ever need anything, I'm one phone call away. You want a funny story that happened to Paul about this. And we read this story over the summer together. Shortly after he wrote this letter to the Romans, he gets arrested in Jerusalem, and he gets brought into the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin. The high priest is there, people are angry, and at one point the high priest tells someone to punch Paul in the face. Uh, Paul doesn't realize it was the high priest that said that, so he shouts back at them, and he calls him a whitewashed wall. Everyone gasps and says, "How can you say that to the high priest?" And Paul stops and says, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest. I wouldn't have said that if I had known." He was probably thinking, "Man, I just wrote a letter to them, to people saying, don't do what I just did." I think it's a funny story because on the one hand, God does tell us to be respectful to our leaders. Just some leaders make that a little bit harder than others. I guess that's something I need to work on, do a better job working on myself.